It was a cool evening and the streets were quieter than usual. The streetlights cast a soft glow, and the steady hum of cars passing by filled the air. The man driving home from work had no idea that his day was about to take a sharp turn. He had just wrapped up another long day at the office and was eager to get home, kick off his shoes, and relax. But the quiet evening was shattered when he saw the flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. Confused, he slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. He had done nothing wrong, at least he thought so. The car was running fine, his seatbelt was on, and everything seemed normal. But as the officer's patrol car stopped behind him, something inside the man told him that this wasn't going to be a simple traffic stop. The officer who stepped out of the car looked tense, his uniform crisp, and his eyes sharp as they scanned the man's car. The officer approached the vehicle quickly, and the man, though calm, could feel the tension in the air. He rolled down his window, unsure of what was about to unfold. The officer didn't say hello or ask for his license right away. Instead, he simply pointed to the car's rear taillight and said, "You've got a busted light back there." The man looked at the taillight, a bit surprised. He hadn't noticed anything wrong with it, but it didn't seem like a major issue. "I wasn't aware," he said politely. "I'll get it checked." Without waiting for the man to finish his sentence, the officer snapped back, his voice sharp and angry. "You didn't notice? That's your problem, huh? Not paying attention?" The tone in the officer's voice was far more aggressive than the situation called for. The man, taken aback, simply nodded, trying to keep the situation calm. "I'm sorry, officer. I'll get it fixed as soon as possible." But the officer wasn't having it. He took a step closer, his hands resting on his hips as he glared at the man. "What, you think you can just drive around with a broken taillight and not get into trouble?" He spoke in a way that made it clear he wasn't just doing his job anymore. His words were laced with a judgment that went beyond the broken light. The man felt his stomach tighten, but he kept his composure. He knew that losing his cool would only make things worse. "I didn't mean any disrespect," he said, trying to explain himself. "I'll make sure it gets fixed." The officer stood there for a moment, not saying anything. Then, with a sudden move, he reached for his baton. The man's heart skipped a beat as the officer swung the baton at the taillight, smashing it with a sharp crack. The sound of the glass breaking echoed in the quiet street. The officer stepped back, looking at the shattered light, his expression almost satisfied. The man was shocked. He hadn't expected this at all. The officer hadn't just pointed out the problem. He had destroyed the light. His mind raced, wondering what had just happened and why the officer had taken such drastic action. "Is that really necessary?" the man asked, his voice shaky but trying to remain calm. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to be angry or confused. The officer didn't answer him. Instead, he stepped back and started writing something in his notebook. His back turned to the man as if he didn't even care about the mess he'd just made. The man's mind was still spinning, and now he felt a knot of frustration in his chest. How could this have happened? How did something so simple turn into such a strange confrontation? The officer finally turned around, and instead of issuing a ticket or explaining what was next, he just glared at the man. "You're lucky I'm not giving you a bigger fine," he muttered, as though it was a favor. The man, still in disbelief, nodded slowly. "I appreciate that, officer," he said, though he was far from feeling thankful. He was beginning to feel uncomfortable, like he was being unfairly targeted for something that didn't seem to warrant such a response. But before he could say anything more, the officer stepped forward and demanded, "Get out of the car." It wasn't a request, but a command. The man hesitated for a moment, trying to figure out why this was happening. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he was being treated as if he had. But he also knew that refusing the officer's demand could only make things worse. With a sigh, he opened the door and stepped out of the car, trying his best to remain composed. As he stood there on the side of the road, the officer began to circle him, still muttering under his breath. He didn't seem to care whether the man was guilty of anything or not. His actions were driven by something deeper than just a routine traffic stop. It was as if the officer had already made up his mind, and nothing the man could say would change it. The man stood there, trying to figure out his next move. His heart was racing, but he didn't want to give in to fear. He could feel the officer's hostility, but there was nothing he could do to calm the situation. The officer's words, though directed at him, felt more like they were meant to put him in his place, whatever that meant. "You're wasting my time," the officer spat, his eyes narrowing. Do you have anything to say for yourself? The man opened his mouth to speak but stopped himself. There was nothing to say, not in this moment. He simply nodded and kept quiet, but deep inside he was thinking, wondering how this had escalated so quickly. A broken taillight shouldn't have turned into an interrogation. It didn't make sense. The officer, not getting the response he wanted, seemed to get even angrier. He was still circling the man, his eyes cold, his voice dripping with disdain. You think you can just go around doing whatever you want? Hiding behind your job, your fancy life? The man's breath caught in his throat, and for a brief moment, he felt like he was in a nightmare. The officer's words were hitting him in a way he hadn't expected. He wasn't just angry at the taillight. He seemed to be angry at the man himself, as if the officer didn't like who he was. And that realization made the man feel something far worse than anger. He felt a deep sense of fear. This wasn't just about the taillight. It was something else entirely. The officer, his expression hardening, stepped back. "I'll be back in a minute," he said coldly, before turning to walk back to his car. The man, still standing there, couldn't help but wonder if things would ever go back to normal or if this would be the moment that changed everything. As the officer walked back to his patrol car, the man stood still, his mind racing. The night felt colder now, as if the atmosphere had shifted. His breath came out in short bursts, the cool air mixing with the tension he felt in his chest. What had just happened? Why was the officer treating him like this? A simple taillight problem had escalated into something much more sinister. He couldn't help but feel that this wasn't just about a broken light. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond the surface. The officer returned to his car, sitting behind the wheel and staring at the man for a long moment. The flashing lights of the patrol car illuminated the street, but it didn't offer any comfort. The man stood in silence, waiting for the officer to do whatever he was going to do next. He didn't know if he should speak up or remain quiet. He had never been in a situation like this before. All he could do was stand there and wonder what was going through the officer's mind. The seconds felt like minutes, and the tension in the air grew thicker with each passing moment. The officer wasn't speaking. He was just sitting there, his eyes locked on the man. It was as if he was waiting for something, maybe an apology, maybe an explanation, but the man had nothing to apologize for. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just driving home, trying to get to his family, to his life. The officer finally got out of the patrol car and walked back to the man. This time, there was something different in his approach. The hostility that had filled the air earlier seemed to have softened, but there was still an undeniable edge to his actions. He didn't seem to know what to do now. The situation had taken a turn that neither of them had expected. "Get in the car," the officer said, his tone no longer as harsh as it had been, but still firm. "We're going to the station." The man hesitated. He had already complied with the officer's orders once before, but this felt different. He wasn't sure if he should go along with it or if he should stand his ground. The officer had no reason to take him to the station. This was just a traffic stop, wasn't it? But the officer wasn't giving him a choice. The man knew he had to get into the car, at least for now. He nodded, trying to hide the confusion and fear that had begun to build inside him. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he felt a growing sense of unease. Something didn't feel right. As they walked to the patrol car, the officer didn't say anything else. The man climbed into the back seat, the cold metal pressing against him as he sat down. The officer got into the driver's seat and started the engine. The car rolled forward, the flashing lights casting strange shadows on the empty road. The silence in the car was almost deafening. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the radio. The man's mind was spinning. He had never felt so helpless in his life. He had always prided himself on keeping his cool, on being able to handle difficult situations. But now he felt like he was losing control. The officer hadn't even explained why he had smashed the tail light. There had been no reason given, no explanation for his actions. The man tried to steady his thoughts, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong this whole situation felt. As the car moved through the quiet streets, the man glanced at the officer in the rearview mirror. He was concentrating on the road, his expression unreadable. The man wondered if the officer realized what he had done. Did he know how badly he had overreacted? Or had he just gotten so caught up in his own anger and frustration that he had lost all sense of reason? The man's thoughts were interrupted when the officer turned onto a side street. The lights of the patrol car flashed brightly in the dark, making everything feel even more surreal. The street was empty, quiet. No other cars were in sight, and the only sounds were the distant hum of the city and the soft whoosh of the tires on the pavement. It was then that the man remembered something important. He had to stay calm. He had to remember who he was. He wasn't just some guy off the street. He was someone who had worked hard to get where he was. Someone who had earned the respect of his peers. He had a job that people looked up to, but more importantly, he had a life that he valued, a family waiting for him at home. He couldn't let this moment define him. He couldn't let the officer's actions make him feel small. The officer pulled the car over to the side of the road and parked. The man's heart skipped a beat. Was this where it would end? What was going to happen next? "Stay here," the officer said as he got out of the car. The man didn't say anything. He just sat in the back seat, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. A few minutes passed before the officer returned to the car. This time there was a different look in his eyes. It wasn't the same anger or hostility that had been there before. There was something almost uncertain about him now. He seemed to be weighing his next move carefully, as if trying to figure out what to do. The officer opened the door and stood there for a moment. "I'm sorry about what happened earlier," he said, his voice quieter now. "I shouldn't have broken your taillight like that." The man was surprised by the apology. He had expected the officer to continue with his harsh attitude, to brush it off as nothing. But instead, the officer had acknowledged what he had done. It wasn't much, but it was something. The man wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to express how unfair everything had felt, how he had been treated with disrespect for no reason. But another part of him wanted to let it go. He had been through enough for one night. "I appreciate that," the man said finally, his voice steady. "But that's not what bothers me. What bothers me is the way you treated me." The officer looked down, his eyes focusing on the ground. He seemed to be thinking carefully about what the man had just said. After a moment, he nodded. "I understand," he said quietly. "I let my temper get the best of me." "It's not an excuse." The man didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what to say. This situation had been so bizarre, so unexpected, that he didn't know how to process it. All he knew was that it wasn't over yet. He wasn't going to let this incident pass without making sure the officer knew that his actions were unacceptable. "What's going to happen now?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. The officer took a deep breath and looked at him. "I'm going to write you a ticket. But I'll be honest with you. This doesn't feel right. I've been thinking about it, and I know I messed up." The man's mind raced. He didn't know what to make of the officer's sudden change in attitude. Was this genuine remorse, or was the officer just trying to cover up his mistake? The man couldn't tell, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. The officer's actions had consequences, and he was going to make sure those consequences were faced. The officer's apology hung in the air, heavy with meaning, but the man wasn't sure if it was enough. The apology felt like an attempt to smooth things over, but the damage had already been done. The man wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for something more, an acknowledgement that what had just happened was wrong, that the officer's actions had crossed a line. As the officer stood there, waiting for a response, the man took a deep breath. He had stayed calm up to this point, but the words he was about to say would determine how the rest of the night played out. "Apologies don't change what happened," the man said, his voice steady but firm. "You destroyed my property for no reason, and you treated me like I was some criminal when I wasn't. That's not okay." The officer looked down, unable to meet the man's eyes. The man could see that the officer was struggling with something, maybe guilt, maybe shame, but whatever it was, it didn't matter. The officer had still chosen to act the way he did. The man had been caught off guard, not by the ticket or the warning, but by the pure hostility that the officer had shown him for no reason other than his own assumptions. For a few long moments, there was nothing but silence between them. The man could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, but he wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to shrink in the face of this unjust treatment. He had worked too hard to get where he was, and he wasn't going to let this officer's actions make him feel small. The officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, then exhaled slowly. I know I messed up," he said quietly. "But I didn't mean it like that. I was just, I don't know, frustrated. It was a bad call, and I should have handled it better." The man nodded slowly, not sure what to make of the officer's words. Was he being sincere? Was this officer really owning up to what he'd done, or was he just trying to cover his tracks? The man didn't have all the answers, but what he did know was that this wasn't the way things were supposed to be. The officer's actions were a reflection of something deeper, something that went beyond the personal animosity he felt that night. "I don't care if you were frustrated," the man replied, his voice quieter now but no less resolute. "I care that you took it out on me. You didn't know me, and yet you treated me like I was some kind of criminal. That's not acceptable." The officer sighed, rubbing his face as if the weight of the situation was pressing down on him. "I hear you," he said, his voice softer now. "But I'm telling you that wasn't the intention. I made a mistake." The man wasn't sure if he believed the officer, but he could see that he was trying. Or at least it seemed like the officer was trying. Whether or not he understood the full weight of his actions was a different question. But the man wasn't going to make excuses for him. He had been humiliated, treated like less than a person, and that wasn't something that could just be brushed aside with a half-hearted apology. The officer glanced at the broken taillight again, the broken pieces still scattered on the ground, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. "I'll pay for the damage," he said suddenly, looking up at the man. "I'll cover the cost of fixing it if that'll make things right." The man was surprised by the offer, but he wasn't sure if it was enough. Fixing the taillight wouldn't fix the way the officer had treated him, the way he had been made to feel like an outsider, an enemy. The man knew that there was a deeper issue here that couldn't just be solved with money. The officer could pay for the taillight, but he couldn't pay for the damage done to the man's sense of dignity. "That's not the point," the man said, his voice quieter now, but firm. "You can pay for the taillight, but that doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change the fact that you judged me without knowing who I was. You took your frustration out on me, and that's something I can't just forget." The officer was quiet for a moment, and the man could tell he was thinking carefully about what he had just said. "I get it," the officer finally said, his voice soft. "I really do. And I'm sorry. I wish I could take it all back. But I can't. All I can do is promise you that I'll do better." The man nodded slowly, his anger slowly starting to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sadness. It wasn't enough, but it was something. He had hoped for more. Hoped that the officer would truly understand the gravity of his actions, but maybe that wasn't possible in such a short time. Maybe it would take more than an apology to fix what had been broken. The officer shifted his weight again, looking out into the dark street. "I'm going to let you go," he said after a moment. "But I want you to know that I'm going to report this. What I did was wrong, and I'm not going to hide from it." The man blinked in surprise. "Report it to who?" "To my superior," the officer explained. "This isn't the kind of thing I can just let slide. It's not just about what happened to you. It's about the way I acted. I need to be held accountable, and so does anyone else who acts like I did." For the first time that night, the man felt a small sense of relief. The officer wasn't just trying to cover his tracks. He was acknowledging that what he had done was wrong, and he was willing to face the consequences. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. The man looked at the officer for a long moment, and then, with a quiet nod, he spoke. "Thank you. I appreciate you saying that." The officer nodded in return, then opened the door and walked back to his patrol car. The man stood there for a moment, watching him go before he turned and walked back to his own car. The streets were still quiet, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the still night air. As he got into his car and started the engine, the man couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. It wasn't just about the taillight. It was about the way people were treated, the assumptions that were made based on nothing more than appearances. The officer had seen him as a threat, as someone to be feared, and it had cost him. But at least there had been a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The man drove home, his thoughts still swirling in his mind. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let this moment define him. He wouldn't let the officer's actions take away his sense of self. And he would keep pushing for change, for justice, no matter how hard it was. The drive home felt like a blur, the streets that once seemed familiar now distant and foreign. The man's mind was caught in a whirlwind of thoughts, each one tumbling over the other, as if trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The flashing lights, the officer's aggression, the strange apology. It all felt surreal, as if he had been part of a dream he couldn't wake up from. But this wasn't a dream. It was real. and the events of the night had left an impression that would stay with him for a long time. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the first thing he did was sit in his car for a few moments, hands gripping the steering wheel. His thoughts kept returning to the same question. Why had the officer acted that way? What had triggered such hostility? The broken taillight had been nothing more than a minor issue, something that could have been easily addressed with a simple warning or ticket. Yet the officer had chosen to escalate the situation, to make it personal. He knew that there was something deeper at play, something that had nothing to do with a taillight. It was a harsh reminder of how easily people could be judged based on nothing more than their appearance, their race, or their circumstances. For the officer, he had seen a black man in a car, and that alone had been enough to treat him as if he was guilty of something. The man shuddered at the thought. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about something much larger, something that affected millions of people every day. He stepped out of the car and walked slowly to the door of his house, the weight of the night still pressing down on him. As he entered, the familiar warmth of his home greeted him, but it didn't bring the comfort it usually did. His family had long since gone to bed and the house was quiet. He moved to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, his mind still restless. The events of the evening kept replaying in his head, each moment more vivid than the last. Sitting down at the table, he took a deep breath, trying to clear his thoughts. It wasn't just the officer's actions that weighed on him. It was the way he had been made to feel. He had been treated as if he was less than human, as if his value was determined by the color of his skin. The officer hadn't seen him as a person, a father, a colleague, or a judge. He had only seen a stereotype, and it had shaped his behavior. The man knew he wasn't the only one who had experienced this. It was a harsh reality that many people, especially black men, faced on a daily basis. The next day, the man couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. He had thought about it all night, and as much as he wanted to forget about it, he knew he couldn't. The officer's actions had not only violated his personal dignity, but had also shown a broader problem within law enforcement. He couldn't let it go. He spent the morning gathering his thoughts, writing down what had happened, and considering his options. He knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, about ensuring that what happened to him didn't happen to someone else. The man wasn't someone who sought attention or wanted to make waves, but he also understood the power of using his position to make a difference. As a federal judge, he had a platform, and it was time to use it. After carefully considering his options, the man made the decision to report the incident. He called the local police department and requested to speak with a supervisor. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that the officer's behavior had to be addressed. The supervisor listened intently as the man explained what had happened, the officer's actions, and how he had been treated. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, but the supervisor assured him that the matter would be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. The man hung up the phone and sat back in his chair. He wasn't sure if he felt any better, but he knew that he had done the right thing. He had taken the first step toward accountability. It wasn't going to be easy, and there was no guarantee that anything would come of it, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. His silence would only allow the officer's behavior to continue unchecked, and that wasn't something he was willing to accept. As the days passed, the man began to notice something. There was a sense of unease, a subtle shift in the way people interacted with him. His colleagues at work seemed to be treating him with a little more respect, and even strangers seemed to take notice of him in a way they hadn't before. It was as if his decision to report the officer had somehow elevated his standing. But it wasn't about personal gain. It was about making a stand for justice. The man continued to think about the officer, wondering what would happen to him. Would he be reprimanded? Would he lose his job? Would anything change? Part of him felt sympathy for the officer, knowing that people were often products of their environments, shaped by their own biases and experiences. But another part of him couldn't ignore the fact that the officer's actions were a reflection of a deeper systemic issue. It wasn't just about this one officer. It was about the culture within law enforcement, the way that certain biases and prejudices were allowed to fester and affect people's lives. A week later, the man received a phone call from the police department. The officer had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The department assured him that they were taking the matter seriously. and that steps would be taken to ensure such behavior was addressed. The man wasn't sure what the final outcome would be, but he was glad that at least something was being done. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done. He began to research organizations that advocated for police reform, looking for ways to get involved. He reached out to others who had faced similar experiences, hoping to learn from them and see what could be done to bring about real change. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to be part of the solution. As he sat in his office one afternoon, going over case files, he received another call. This time, it was from a reporter who had caught wind of the story. The reporter was asking for a statement, wanting to know how the man felt about the officer's actions and the steps being taken to address the situation. The man paused for a moment, considering how much to share. He had always been a private person, not one to seek out the spotlight. But this wasn't about him. It was about something bigger. He agreed to the interview, knowing that his words could have an impact. When the story was published, it quickly gained traction. People from all walks of life reached out to him, sharing their own stories of mistreatment, of being judged based on the color of their skin. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, and the man realized just how many people had faced similar challenges. It was a humbling experience, but it also reinforced his belief that change was possible. The officer's actions had been wrong, but they had sparked a conversation about race, about policing, about justice. And while the road ahead was still long, the man knew that he had made a difference. His actions had started a ripple effect, one that would hopefully lead to a more just and fair society for everyone. As he sat back in his office chair looking out the window, the man felt a sense of resolve. The journey wasn't over, but he was no longer the man he had been before that night. He was stronger now, more determined, and he would continue to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced, who had been treated unfairly. He knew that together, change was possible. Days turned into weeks, and while the man tried to get back to his normal life, the impact of that night lingered. The echoes of the officer's words, the weight of the situation, and the emotions he had felt continued to swirl in his mind. He had done what he believed was the right thing, but there was a part of him that couldn't let go. Was this the end of the story? Or was it just the beginning? The police department had completed its internal investigation, and the officer in question had been disciplined. It wasn't the outcome the man had expected, but it was a step in the right direction. The officer had been given a written warning and ordered to attend sensitivity training. The man was informed that further steps would be taken to ensure the officer understood the seriousness of his actions. It wasn't enough to undo the hurt, but it was something. But even with the officer's punishment, the man couldn't stop thinking about what it all meant. Was this just a one-time mistake, or was this part of a larger pattern? Was this officer the only one who treated people this way? The man had heard stories from others, stories that mirrored his own experience. The more he listened, the more he realized how deep the issue ran. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. It was about years of prejudice, bias, and inequality woven into the fabric of law enforcement. He spent more time thinking about it, reading articles, and speaking with people who had faced similar treatment. He began to understand that the problem wasn't just the actions of a single individual, but the mindset that existed within the system. The officer's behavior had been a reflection of a larger issue, one that affected communities across the country, and one that needed to be addressed. The man knew that change would take time, but he was ready to be a part of it. He couldn't stay silent anymore. One morning he woke up with a clear sense of purpose. He had already made a difference by reporting the officer and speaking out, but now he needed to do more. He could use his position to advocate for change, to raise awareness about the issues that so many people were facing every day. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but the fight for justice never was. The man decided to reach out to a few organizations that were working on police reform. He connected with activists, community leaders, and legal experts who were passionate about making change. Together, they discussed ways to bring about meaningful reform within the police force, to ensure that no one else would have to experience what he had gone through. He became involved in local initiatives aimed at improving relations between law enforcement and the community. He worked on creating programs that would educate officers about racial biases and train them to better understand and serve diverse communities. As he became more involved, he saw the power of collective action. The more people who joined the conversation, the more momentum they gained. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about transforming an entire system. It was about ensuring that the dignity and humanity of every person, regardless of race, was respected and upheld. At work, the man's colleagues began to notice a change in him. He was more driven, more vocal, and more determined to make a difference. He shared his experiences, both the painful and the hopeful, and encouraged others to think critically about the role of law enforcement in society. Many of his colleagues were surprised by the depth of the issue, and some were moved to take action themselves. The man realized that his journey had sparked something larger than he had anticipated. People were listening and they were ready to take action too, but not everyone shared his vision. Some still believed that things were fine the way they were. They didn't see the problem, or they didn't want to. The man faced pushback, criticism, and even personal attacks. But he didn't back down. He had already seen the consequences of ignoring injustice, and he wasn't willing to turn a blind eye anymore. Months passed, and the man continued his work with the reform groups. He became more well-known within the community, his story a symbol of perseverance and the fight for justice. People began reaching out to him for guidance, for advice on how to speak up, how to create change. He shared his experiences openly, understanding that his voice had the power to inspire others to do the same. Then one day he received a call from a local news outlet. They wanted to do a story on him, to highlight the journey he had taken since that fateful night. The man hesitated at first. He wasn't seeking the spotlight, but he realized that this was another opportunity to raise awareness, to reach more people, and to continue the conversation about police reform and racial equality. The interview was scheduled, and when the day came, the man stood in front of the camera, ready to share his story with the world. He spoke candidly about his experience, about the anger and confusion he had felt, but also about the hope and determination that had followed. He talked about the work he had done since, the people he had met, and the changes that were already starting to happen. The story aired on the local news, and soon it spread across social media, drawing attention from people near and far. Messages of support poured in from all corners of the country, and the man realized just how powerful one voice could be when it was used for good. In the months that followed, he became an advocate for change. He continued to speak at rallies, attend meetings, and work with organizations that were pushing for police reform. His efforts were starting to pay off. He could see tangible changes in his community. Officers were receiving better training. Citizens were more involved in the conversation, and the relationship between law enforcement and the public was beginning to improve. It wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to be done, but the man was hopeful. Change was happening one step at a time. Despite the progress, the man never forgot that night. He never forgot how he had been treated, how he had been reduced to a stereotype. But he had also learned something valuable. He had learned that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, can change the world. He had learned that one person, speaking from the heart, can inspire others to do the same. As he sat in his office one day, reflecting on everything that had happened, the man realized that his journey was far from over. He had started something that would continue long after his involvement. The fight for justice, for equality, would go on, and he would be a part of it for as long as he could. But for now, he was at peace. He had faced adversity, had stood up against the odds, and had made a difference. He had done what he could to help heal the wounds of a broken system, and that was enough.